I shall now briefly run through some of the changes that have taken place on converting the A3 Flying Scotsman into the schools. I had an idea on just how I wanted the finished engine to look. How I was to achieve this took many changes, and just over 9 months. Being a 440, the first big change was to move the axle. The front driving axle on the Flying Scotsman was removed. The middle axle was retained, but the rubber tyres were fitted to this, and the last set of rear drivers were moved nearer the cab. The chassis was cut down through the centre line of the first driving axle, and the cylinder block was mounted to a new bracket and fixed in this position. It was thought that there might be increased wear on these axles, as there was now only 2 and not 3 axles as in the Flying Scotsman, so a change to ball bearings was adopted. The chassis was bored out to take the bearings, and a bearing housing was manufactured to take the bearing on the right hand side. The first driving axle with its bearing and bearing housing, all that was needed to do now was to machine out the back bearing and replace these with ball races. You can see just how free running the new bearings are. The motor brush tags were moved to be on the same side of the motor, and some of the metalwork of this component were also cut down. The electronics had the biggest changes. There were something like 10 or 12 changes to this one area alone. This small board was the flickering fire, which replaced the Hornby red and green lights. It was fitted at the bottom back end of the engine, near where the drag box would be. As the regulator on the control unit is moved over, say, to forward gear, the light would start to flash at some point, telling the driver the engine was about to move off. Every time a new design was to be tested, it had to first be covered in araldite to keep out the water. The switch to operate this flashing light was by way of a reed switch fitted in a similar position on the Hornby engines, but with a magnet fitted to the regulator arm. Here you can see the magnet swinging across over the reed switch. As the magnet closed the reed switch, it would also flash much brighter. And again, as this happens, the light in the cab will start to flash. Oh, what fun we had soldering these very small components onto the printed boards. I must have lost 3 on the floor for every one I managed to get soldered on. This small printed board was to have a solid state relay soldered onto it, and the board itself would be fitted in a cavity between the driving wheels at the bottom of the chassis. The wires would feed through 2 holes in either side of the chassis up to the motor and the heater. Now we had some work in electronics. The safety valve was the next thing that had to be moved. This would appear in the cab and wouldn't look at all right. We needed the cab to represent a true schools cab. Next was the tender. This not only had the wrong number of wheels for a southern region schools, but it also needed a smaller tank to fit inside the body of the schools tender. The tank was made slightly longer than the A3 tank and did give on one run 44 minutes. The only changes to the front bogie was to add a new screw with a spring. This would help take some of the weight off the front of the engine. The oil tank had to be lengthened to bring the exhaust under the chimney on the schools engine. Sometimes the testing didn't always go right.
that bridge.
The layout of the school's cab, with all the controls on view, no printed boards, red or green lights to hide the view. One of the best changes I think I made was to add a valve to the top of the oil tank. This made filling the oil tank much easier than before. There was no chimney to remove, no screw to remove, just inject straight down the chimney into the tank and off you go again. This part of my layout was the most testing. It was uphill and on a bend. Now let's ride on the train round the track. I think Railtrack's been maintaining this lot. And so the testing went on, trying this and trying that, running the engine backwards, forwards, over points, crossings, and include loading it up with carriages to see if its tractive effort was still as good as it was when it was a A3. With 8 carriages on, the engine performed fantastically. It was uphill, round bends. It hadn't got the weight in it that the A3s had. There was not enough room for that. And even its body was off, and the engine still performed very well. I like to think that Richard Mansell would be most impressed. His 440 design was reputed to be one of the most powerful in Europe. Now the final touches could be added. Painting, then the transfers, and a final test to make sure all is still working okay. One of the things I wanted was working oil lamps. I did manage to make these, but they were very difficult owing to their small size. So thank you for watching. I must get on with my West Country now. That will be the next engine to complete. A slightly easier project I feel this time. Larger casing, longer chassis. Thanks again. Goodbye.